We're up to Chapter 9 in this class, and the first thing I better say is that we'll not have any physical class meeting on campus next week. I'll be on the Twitch channel. You can connect remotely, but they're turning off the power on the science building as part of a construction project, so we can't use the science building next week. So on the 22nd, don't come physically. So let's talk about the cell network. Cell network is a group of cells. That's what the name comes from. So you have these towers all over the place, those things, and mobile switching centers switch data from one packet to another. So you have the public switch telephone network, PSTN. That is the old-fashioned telephone network that originally was just analog signals over wires. And that's now connected to the cell stations, which connect them to the mobile switching center. So the base transceiver station is what you see up on these poles, these big antennas, and each one of these antennas can handle a certain number of cell calls at once, and they're controlled by a base station controller. There's a handoff, which is when you move, so your phone call is transmitted from one tower to another. And even if you're not in a call right now, your phone is always associated with the tower, so you can receive incoming calls. And therefore, the cell network knows approximately where you are at all times. Not with great accuracy, but they know which cell towers you're connected to, and that means you're closer to that cell tower than any of the others, at least getting a stronger signal. And so that's why you can get general information about where people are, even if they don't have a location turned on their phone. All right, so law enforcement can ask them where people have been, and they'll get a list of all their calls. This is a pen register, like we talked about before, where you just get a list of calls, who you called, and how long the call was. That's often extremely valuable, even without getting the contents of the call. Then you get subscriber information like name, address, and social security number. And you can also get PIN unblocking key codes we'll talk about, which are what you're going to need to get code from a phone without the user's login. So the mobile station is the handset, your phone, and the SIM card. The two have to be together. As you know, if you get a phone without a SIM card, you can't make any phone calls until you get a SIM card or a SIM number in it in one way or another. It doesn't necessarily have to come in on a card. And there's an IMEI number that uniquely identifies the handset. There's a UICC card that identifies you on a GSM network. That's a SIM card. For the other one, it's a universal SIM. And that gives you yet another number, mobile equipment identifier. There's a lot of different numbers used. Now, in America, a lot of phones are sold cheaply and locked to one provider. But under the Obama administration, there was an order issued that made it legal to unlock your phone from the provider and move to a different provider before your contract expired. So you can theoretically do that legally now, although you could do it with hacking tools before. Anyway, so they have an FCC ID in America because the FCC restricts radio interference. And therefore, any device using the radio bands must be tested to make sure that they are not interfering with other devices. And this has, in fact, turned into a big storm because the rollout of, I think it's 5G, conflicts with some older radios used by airplanes to locate them under certain conditions of bad weather. And so for the past 2 years or so, over the great objections of the cell phone carriers, they have been ordered not to deploy the full latest version of 5G near airports. And every month or so I read about more court cases and arguments about that. All right, so the SIM card is this little card which serves the same function as a floppy disk. It's a small card that can store some data, and it has your identifying numbers in it. Integrated circuit card ID, mobile country code, and so on. The number is on here. And so when you connect to a cell phone, it passes to the home location register, the visitor location register, is where it passes user information to decide if you have in fact paid a bill and you're actually subscribed to a phone network it recognizes. It authenticates you. So it has to know who you are, so it can tell whose phone to ring, and so it can tell who to bill for phone calls you make. So a mobile network operator runs their network like Verizon and T-Mobile and AT&T. There are virtual mobile network operators like Google Fi that operate on the network of a mobile network operator. This is because there's been endless legal battles since the 1960s over the phone networks in America. AT&T originally owned them all. Then they decided to break up AT&T. Then they decided to force AT&T to let other people use their wires so other phone networks could exist, and then they merged them back again. And it's gone back and forth. Anyway, so cell communications have gone from 2G up to 5G, and 2G was an old system that, among its other failures, was not very well encrypted. GSM is an international standard. And code division, multiple access, is one way to have many signals on the same wire using a spread spectrum communication methodology where they're each hopping between frequencies. And time division, multiple access, is the older system where each call gets a duration of time, and then the next call gets a duration of time, and so on. They're just different ways for data to pass over the line. So the SIM card has an interface which communicates with the device. So that's the electrical contact used to read it, and also store data on it. And it stores a lot of data on the SIM card. So it's got subscriber information stored in these EF files. The dialing number, forbidden public land mobile network, last number dialed, area where user last powered down phone, list of SMSs. So it's got a lot of information about what you've been doing on your phone, but it's protected by your PIN. And typically, if you have 3 guesses at the PIN and you fail, then it will get locked. So if that happens, then you need to get a PIN unlocking key from the carrier, assuming you don't have access to the real PIN, which apparently you don't. All right. And so you can find out if an SMS message was read or deleted or unread. You can see them all there, and so that's quite useful. All right, and now we talk about the operating system of the phone itself. Android is based on Linux, and it's got the common Linux partition. /boot is the boot code. Their system contains the operating system. Then you have a recovery image, a cache, miscellaneous. The most important thing for us is data. Data is where all the apps are stored and where all the data for all the apps is. So that's where you're going to find SMS messages, emails, pictures that are taken with the camera, and all the personal stuff. All the rest of this is not of much use because the operating system itself just comes from Google and it's the same everywhere. The only thing you might find there is maybe the dates something happened in log files would be the only thing I imagine that would be important for investigations. All right. And you can find a list of the packages on there, so that helps too. Although I would just look at what's in the data folder. In the data folder, there's a separate folder for every app too. All right, most modern computers and phones encrypt data, or at least the latest ones do. All iPhones have since iPhone 3S. Only the more expensive Androids do. Computers, some of them encrypt and some of them don't. But if the storage is encrypted, then it's almost impossible to get in without having the password or PIN. There are a couple of very exotic attacks for an encrypted computer, encrypted with BitLocker or Apple's File Vault, but those are extremely exotic, involving freezing the RAM and catching the machine when it's still powered on. But for a phone, there are plenty of ways to get in. Cellebrite can punch through and get the data off any phone, they say. So they've just found defects in the operating systems. They'll let them get in without the PIN, although there are no free public exploits to do that. Now, another way to do it is with JTAGs. And so here you have a thing called a RIFbox. And what you do is you solder, you can use this to recover routers that are brick too. You connect this switch, this hardware, you solder it to pins on the device, and now you can read the contents of the ROM on a device. And this is how engineers develop the ROM. This is how they adjust the data on it and read the data on it while they're developing the box. But when they ship it, they don't bother to include the JTAG chip, but you can do that. So you can read the data directly off of there and find out what the firmware is, and this is an essential part of hardware hacking. We don't have a course in hardware hacking. I wish we could. If we get our staff put back in, maybe we will, because Liz, one of our part-time instructors, is an expert in hardware hacking and car hacking, and it would be great to have her teaching a course in it. And this is one of the things you do, is suck the data off the chip to get the firmware that's running the device, when it's just frequently not provided by the manufacturer, and they don't even provide an easy way for you to get it by the manufacturer. Now, there's another thing you can do. You can do chip-off forensics, and DriveSaver does this, although it's not something an amateur would do. This is where you take the chips off the board. You desolder them, and you take the chips one by one, put them in a holder, and read the bits off them one by one. It is difficult. Then you have to reconstruct the data, which is complicated, but it can be done. And this is one way to get 100% of the data off the phone. The problem is, if it's encrypted, you're just getting encrypted data. You'll have to decrypt that. And also the process is, difficult to accomplish. You need a clean room. You need special equipment. It's expensive and doesn't always work. But anyway, that is one way to get all the data off a phone, just by physically reading the chips. All right. There's another way to do it with programming to get access files that are stored. And as you know, in this class, we did it just by running a script on a rooted phone to just copy the data to a file, which is a simple way to get the active data off a phone. There's also sometimes an emergency download mode on some phones that will let you download data. So Androids have pins or passwords or pattern locks or biometrics, fingerprint and face print on different phones. And there are ways to defeat all of these. Some of them are easier to defeat than others. Now, if you can turn on USB debugging, then you can remotely control the device through the charger port with the USB Android Debug Bridge. And we do this, that's how we're connecting to our simulated Androids and getting the data off, and that's fine. But of course, that means you have the PIN, you can log in, and you can go in and turn this on. So you're not likely to find a phone seized in evidence that has that turned on. Although some cheap phones actually ship with ADB turned on, which is a serious security flaw. At least I've seen cheap Android tablets that have that, and I imagine the cheapest phones might too. So applications have data in them. They have typically a SQLite database. The applications are written in Java. So it's recorded to every hotspot your phone sees, whether you connect or not. And that can another way that records, you can find out where you've been. And all these apps record everything, chats, photos, and searches, and so on. So the general information for standard operating procedures for handling handset evidence is in first place, you should validate your tools. We were talking about this last week. There is a test, a forensic expert witness test. Your tools should be validated to be operating up to the standards. There are standard tests you do to make sure your tools are reliable. And then, all right. Then when you seize the device, you should ensure the safety of individuals. So first you secure the scene by putting out the yellow tape everywhere, so get all the people that are not important out of there. Then you document it, like videotaping it. Then you collect the evidence in a way that preserves their value, and you package and transport it in storage so that you protect it from being damaged or lost on the way back to the lab and from being tampered with on the way back to the lab, so you can maintain a chain of custody. You can testify in court, I went to the scene, I took the thing, I secured it, took it back and locked it up, so I made sure that nobody messed with it. And so that means you have to remove it from the network. And so you typically use Faraday bags, although paint cans work too. Any kind of metal container would do. Now, when you put a phone in a metal container, it can't reach any wireless networks, which is what you want, because it might be receiving, for example, a remote wipe code from somebody. And but that also means it will turn the Wi-Fi power up to maximum, trying to reach a cell phone tower or a cellular network. To turn the radios up to maximum and drain the battery quickly. So you should have a portable battery that you connect to it to keep it charged while it's in the can, while you take it back there, because if you let it power off, then you may be hosed, because when you turn it back on, it will ask for a PIN, and if you don't have that, you won't be able to get the data, unless you have one of these expensive devices to bypass the PIN, like Cellebrite. So another option you might think about is signal jammers. When cell phones became popular about 15 years ago, the movie theater industry got very interested in cell phone jammers because they wanted people to stop getting phone calls during the movie. And they investigated it and discovered that it is illegal to run a signal jammer in America because people make emergency phone calls for medical emergencies and such, and therefore you're taking a huge risk if you block that. So even though another option might be to use a signal jammer, you can't be using that in America. So what you do is put it in a can or a Faraday bag. So here's some tools that will get you in the phone. GrayKey will get you in iPhones by just trying every pin until it gets in. This works at least for 4-digit pins. It can take a while. There's a BitPim, MobileEdit, E3, and as I mentioned, Cellebrite, the most powerful, expensive tool from Israel that claims they can get the data off any phone without being able to unlock it. So I imagine that's true. but you can only get it if you are a law enforcement agency and if you pay their high prices. As you can imagine, that kind of hacking expertise does not come cheap. There's another company not on the list here that does the same thing called Elcomsoft, but they're Russian, and I kind of imagine that most people, especially law enforcement agencies, are not in a hurry to use any Russian software in America anymore after the disasters we've had lately. With Kaspersky, for example. They make the technically best antivirus, but that antivirus was responsible for stealing NSA secrets and sending it back to Moscow where it was used against us to form a worm. And then the Russia attacked all of us with the supply chain attack through SolarWinds. And since we're practically at war with Russia, I would highly recommend nobody should be using any Russian products at all in America, certainly not in law enforcement or government work, because obviously there are people that are going to use them to hurt us. All right. That's why I quit using Telegram. Telegram is Russian. I got rid of Telegram and I use Signal because Signal is American. All right, anyway, so you can also, if all these complicated techniques fail, but you can just see the data on the screen, you can just put a camera in a rig like this and just photograph the screen and thumb through the pages. And as I say, you don't get 100% of the data that way, but whatever data you get, that's real evidence. So, remember, the real evidence is a human. As a matter of fact, if you just looked at it and saw the messages and then testified in court, I looked at it and saw the messages, that would also be evidence. Anything you see with your own eyes is evidence. The photographs help, but the point is the real evidence is the human in court testifying, because the whole theory of the court system is the jury can judge whether you are lying or not. And some kind of written evidence is not as important as real eyewitness testimony from a human saying, I saw something. All right. And so, as you mentioned, you got to get a warrant if you want to seize a cell phone, same with a computer, unless you get consent or exigent circumstances or some other exception incident to arrest. I'm not quite sure what that is, but I think there'll be some terms when you arrest someone, you're allowed to take the devices that they have on them, something like that. I'm not quite sure exactly what this one means. And the warrants will describe what you're allowed to seize, and you can only examine the data that the warrant allows you to examine. All right, typically specifying which devices you're allowed to see. So that's it for this chapter, and let's try a Kahoot. This is module 9, I think. Yeah, all right. So I got Kahoots here. Type. There's module 9. All right. No comments in the chat. Good. Oh, there's someone said good morning. Good morning. I guess we got everybody that's coming. Okay, so which one of these is the cell phone? It's the mobile station, all right? of which value uniquely identifies a handset. IMEI number. By the way, here's a fun question. What number uniquely identifies a computer? And the answer is there is none. There is no number at all. This is why software piracy is such a problem. There's no way to tell which computer is like authorized to watch a movie and when it's a different computer. You might say the MAC address, but that comes from software and can be changed. And there has been a lot of, when Microsoft wanted to license their product, they had to find all kinds of numbers like the processor serial number and such and try to generate a unique number. But the fact is hardware repair could make that number change. And there was a big push to add a unique identifier to computers like this to resist software piracy, but that was never enforced. And your computers do not contain any similar unique number to identify them. Anyway. All right, so which MSC item issues the encryption keys? It is the Authentication Center. All right, good. I wasn't sure about that one myself. But logically, it should be the Authentication Center after you're logged in, I guess. All right, what partition is the most important to examine on an Android phone? All right, it's the data folder. Now, I'm not sure if that's really what you call a partition. I'd have to run fdisk on an Android phone to find out. But anyway, the site data is where all the data from the apps is, and that's the most important thing to examine. It might be just a folder, but maybe it really is a partition. An interesting question. I know Mac computers have like 15 partitions, which is crazy. Windows machines typically have only 2. 100 megabyte partition used for boot up, and all the rest is just where all your operating system and data is stored. I don't know how a hard disk for Android is partitioned. I know you don't have to partition into many partitions, but maybe it often is. Anyway, all right.